Hey guys, last video of the year here. I had already been planning on making you thank you slash congratulations slash have a great summer video for the last day of the last week of school. But as I was perusing my social media this morning, a teacher friend of mine from Mankato, Minnesota, made a video to his students of what he called his last lecture. And in this last lecture, he commented on some of the core values that he hoped that his kids had taken from his class that year, and also issued some commentary on the murder of George Floyd. And I was pretty moved by that video, and it also kind of evoked from me a certain sense of responsibility that if I don't offer you some similar commentary as your social studies teacher, I'm really not doing my job. And so this is my attempt to kind of replicate what my good friend from Mankato did for his students this morning. And so I'm going to take the same template, and I'm going to start with core values. I've got two values that I was really hoping throughout the year, if you have me through the course of the year, only through this semester, that I'm really hoping that you take from my class, aside from all the content that we studied. And one of those is historical consciousness. You are writing a lesson on this, or writing an essay on this right now, historical consciousness. And I think historical consciousness, the ability to understand the present through understanding the past that created this present, is a super essential ability to have to understand what's happening in our state, in our country right now. One thing you probably keep reading and you probably keep hearing is that the murder of George Floyd did not take place in a vacuum. You know, the response that we've seen to his murder is not just to what happened that Memorial Day evening on 38th in Chicago in Southeast Minneapolis. This is the result of 400 years of oppression and injustices committed against Black people in the United States of America. And you really do need a historical consciousness to be able to wrap your head around what's happening in the world right now. If you don't understand the history of slavery and the history of Jim Crow and segregation and all the unfinished business of the civil rights movement, we talked about how when Martin Luther King was murdered, he was working on economic justice. And we've looked at voting rights and educational inequality, and obviously with the murder of George Floyd, police brutality. All this stuff has historic roots. And so if you want to understand the manifestation of all this stuff today, knowing the history, knowing where it came from, really helps you understand the unbelievable worldwide response that the murder of this one man, this one individual, George Floyd, has elicited. And so historical consciousness is a super important skill that I hope you guys can all put to use a little bit in trying to wrap your head around what's happening in the world right now. Another skill, and this one is perhaps less explicit. I'm not sure if I've quizzed you explicitly on your ability to demonstrate this skill, but it's something that's important to me and that I've tried to simulate for you a lot over the course of this semester, and that's perspective taking. The importance of perspective taking and the importance of being able to have empathy for people whose experiences might be different from your own. And I think especially in the response, some of the responses that we've seen to the murder of George Floyd, this is a super important skill. And so obviously you are all aware of a lot of the destruction that has taken place, specifically in the cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul, the looting and burning of businesses and buildings. It's pretty awful stuff. And it's stuff that even in the response to an injustice as grave as what happened to George Floyd is pretty difficult to condone. And I would never ask anyone to try to condone the kind of destruction that we've seen in the response to George Floyd's murder. but I would push people to try to understand it, to try to take that perspective of the people who may be committing these acts and the reasons that could lead to those kind of actions. And a couple quotes I think that can help us with this. Let's start with Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr. said that riots are the language of the unheard. And Martin Luther King, as you might guess, because of his dedication to peaceful protests, he did not support the riots that were taking place in the late 1960s, the race riots that were happening around the country, kind of similar to what's happening right now. He did not condone those. But Martin Luther King also understood them. Martin Luther King understood that the communities in which these riots were taking place were communities that had been ignored and neglected for centuries. And they had no voice. And so the violent response and the destructive response was a way to get themselves heard. It doesn't mean you condone it, but it does mean you understand it. And that should affect the way that you respond to it. If you can have some empathy for where these destructive actions come from. Another quote for you, and this is from Howard Zinn. You've read a little bit of Howard Zinn if you've taken my class. And Howard Zinn said that the cry of the poor is not always just, but if you don't listen to it, you will never know what justice is. Kind of the same idea. The idea that the burning and looting of buildings is not necessarily a just response to the murder of George Floyd, but if you don't understand where that voice comes from, the cry of the poor, the cry of the oppressed, the cry of the disenfranchised, you'll never know what justice is. And I think those are super important considerations to take when trying to evaluate how you feel about what's taking place on the streets of Minneapolis and a lot of cities around the country, and what you think the response should be to those actions. And I think the last thing I want to talk about is what can we do about it? And so we are individuals, and certainly the response that is needed to adequately address the inequities, the racial inequities in this country, is something beyond what we can do as individuals. This is something that requires systemic change. This isn't just the result of racist individuals either. Racist individuals don't have the power to create the kind of racial injustice we see in this country in this moment. We need systemic change, changes to systems that, whether or not they're filled with racist individuals, seem to produce racist outcomes. That includes schools, that includes our criminal justice system and police, that includes the way we organize our economy, that includes our government. This kind of problem takes a systemic response that is so huge in scope that it can really make us feel helpless as individuals. And so what is it that we can do? And one suggestion I would have is I don't think this is a time where we should climb into our silos, where we should hide in our bubbles with our people who think like we do and speak like we do, and reinforce our own view of the world. I've been seeing a lot of defriending going on social media, a lot of people posting, if you think this, just go ahead and defriend me or block me. I understand that. I understand the desire to not have your news feed filled with toxic or hateful or ignorant posts or posts that you disagree with. But I also think if you're someone who uses your social media platform to try to create change and express views and opinions, you're really limiting the change that you can do if you are only surrounded by people who already think like you do. There's no need to make a politically charged post if everybody that's going to see that post has the same politics that you do. And so I really do think that this is a time where we need to be talking with each other and trying to understand one another. This is a time where you should go on Twitter and try to follow people who don't think like you do, so that you're forced to be challenged sometimes, to have your beliefs challenged when you log into your social media account. The second thing that I think we can do as individuals, and I really do think this is important, is I think we all need to be able to unequivocally state Black Lives Matter. And that may seem political, but I think that's kind of the problem. Black Lives Matter has historically been a politically charged statement since it kind of surfaced 4 or 5 years ago. And I don't think it should be. I don't think it should be political to be able to say that Black Lives Matter. And some people will respond with, well, why don't we just say that all lives matter? And I don't think that to say Black Lives Matter is to say that all lives don't matter. I think, though, that to say Black Lives Matter is to recognize that as a country, Black lives have not always mattered when compared to other lives. And to this day, both in life and in death, certainly don't matter oftentimes as much as other lives. And so saying Black Lives Matter is not saying that other lives don't matter. It's simply recognizing that we as a country have a problem in the way that we treat Black people. That if you are born Black in this country, you are statistically in almost every area more likely to be disadvantaged than you are if you are born with white skin. And saying Black Lives Matter recognizes that problem. It does not mean that you subscribe to everything that every group or individual does under the banner Black Lives Matter. It doesn't mean that. It just simply means that you agree with that general sentiment. And I think that's an important step that we as a country need to take. Doesn't matter if you're a Democrat or a Republican or apolitical. Everyone in this country should be able to say Black Lives Matter and should be able to mean it. I think that's super, super important. And so that's what I think I'll leave you with. I hope that my class has helped to give you some of the tools that you need to navigate this super complex and complicated situation and the issues that we find ourselves discussing right now. And I hope that you can be a generation that is able to use some of those tools to create positive change in the world. To use another quote, Gandhi, be the change you wish to see in the world. So if you stuck with me through this whole video, thank you very much for watching. Thanks for being a part of my class this semester and school year. And yeah. That's it.